Welcome to the deep dive. You know, when I hear ADHD, I kind of think like kids,
Yeah.
Bouncing off the walls. But the stuff you gave me for this deep dive, wow. Research papers, medical definitions, even like historical stuff. It's amazing. This goes way beyond childhood.
Yeah, it's really interesting how much our understanding of ADHD has changed, even in the last few years.
Totally.
You've really hit on something here where, science is finally catching up with what a lot of adults have been experiencing their whole lives.
No? And speaking of, I was reading this one study. It said about half the kids diagnosed with ADHD don't grow out of it. Like they carry it with them into adulthood.
That is a really important takeaway from these materials. It's not that the symptoms go away completely. It's more like they change,
Yeah.
Like instead of a kid who can't sit still, you might have an adult who feels this intense, like inner restlessness. Like their brain is just stuck on fast forward.
Okay, that actually reminds me, before we get into like all the heavy science stuff, I have to ask you, you know that feeling when you're stuck in a boring meeting and you just have to doodle or fidget with something?
Uh-huh.
Could that be, even a little bit of an ADHD thing?
You're already thinking like an ADHD detective. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, right? It's not always the really obvious in-your-face stuff. Sometimes it's these subtler ways that attention, or the lack of it, plays out.
Okay, so we're talking about ADHD sticking around into adulthood. But how do doctors even figure out if someone has it? There's no blood test, right?
You've hit on a really major point of debate here, and the research you picked out really highlights this. Right now, there's no one single test that just tells you, yep, you have ADHD. It's way more about looking at a bunch of different symptoms and figuring out how those symptoms, how they impact a person's life, how they make them feel.
Which is interesting because I did see some stuff about potential biomarkers like phenethylamine. They're finding this in lower levels in people with ADHD. So is this the missing piece? Could this be the key to, a more concrete diagnosis?
This is where things get really interesting. This research you found on phenethylamine, it's still pretty new, but it's got some pretty cool clues. What they're finding is that this substance, which has to do with attention and mood, it's not just lower in people with ADHD, it's also affected by the medications they're often given.
Wait, so the medication itself is changing the levels of the thing they're trying to measure? That seems...
It's complicated.
Yeah.
And that's what makes diagnosing ADHD even harder. It's like trying to hit a moving target,
Okay.
Phenethylamine might be part of the puzzle, but it's probably not the whole picture.
There's always more to the story.
Okay.
Right. Speaking of more to the story, I know some people are, skeptical about ADHD. They think it's overdiagnosed, maybe even made up. So what's the deal with that?
It's so important to talk about those different viewpoints, especially in a deep dive like this. One of the biggest arguments against ADHD is this idea that we're seeing way too many diagnoses, especially in kids, right? And these critics are saying, well, maybe we're just too quick to label kids who are just being kids.
Right. So are we just calling normal childhood behavior a disorder?
That's one side of it, yeah. And some of these sources you've shared even suggest that, societal pressures are playing a role in this. Think about it. Increased pressure in school, the pressure to succeed, all that stuff. Kids are dealing with a lot these days.
So it's almost like we're looking for a reason, an explanation for behavior that might just be part of growing up in, our modern kind of crazy world.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's what makes this whole debate so complex, right? We have to consider that, maybe sometimes overdiagnosis happens. And those societal pressures are definitely real. But, and this is a big but, we also can't ignore the mountain of evidence that points to ADHD being rooted in biology, especially genetics.
Okay, genetics. See, I always thought ADHD was more about your environment, how you were raised, all that. But some of these research papers, they go deep into DNA, heritability, all that stuff.
And that's what's so cool about this deep dive, right? We're going beyond just the surface level.
Mm-hmm.
One study you shared really jumped out at me. It said something like 74% of ADHD is because of genetics.
74%. So you're saying my genes basically decide if I have attention problems. That seems kind of limiting, doesn't it?
Well, it's not quite that straightforward. And that's what makes it so fascinating. Imagine this. Your genes, they're the blueprint for how your brain handles attention. Okay. But then your environment, That's like the contractor coming in, making choices about how to build a house based on that blueprint.
Okay, so I might be like predisposed to getting distracted easily because of my genes, but whether I actually end up with ADHD, like full-blown ADHD, that depends on how I grew up, where I went to school, all that.
Exactly. And it's not just about one gene either. It's more like a whole bunch of them working together, each one adding its own little piece to this like big complex puzzle of attention and hyperactivity.
That makes a lot more sense. Something else really struck me when I was reading through all this. I realized I had this like really narrow view of ADHD. I thought it was just about attention, like not being able to pay attention. But there's all this stuff about executive function, emotional regulation. So like, what's the connection?
That's a huge EE part of it.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's where a lot of conversations about ADHD, they kind of miss the mark. ADHD isn't just about like zoning out during a movie, right? It's about these challenges with how our brains like manage all the things, planning, organizing, not doing things impulsively, all that stuff.
So it's not just paying attention, it's about what you do once you're paying attention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, imagine you're building a Lego set. You've got all the pieces, right? That's like your brain power, your potential. But with ADHD, it's like you lost the instruction manual. That's kind of like your executive function going MIA.
Oh, tell me about it. I love Legos, but without those instructions, I'm lost.
And that's why understanding executive function is so important. It impacts everything. Starting and finishing tasks, ignoring distractions, even just like those split-second decisions about what's important, what to focus on.
Wow. So it's like that part of our brains, the control center, it's a little glitchy. And that's why even little things, simple tasks, can feel impossible sometimes for someone with ADHD.
You got it. And then on top of all that, there's emotional regulation. The sources you found, they talk about how people with ADHD often experience emotions more intensely. It's harder to kind of like put the brakes on those big feelings.
So it's like the world feels louder, more intense, and you're trying to navigate that while also like dealing with these other challenges. No wonder people say it's not just a kids being kids thing.
It really isn't. It's about recognizing those real, neurological differences in the ADHD brain. It's about understanding why something that seems simple to you or me, like, hey, clean your room, can feel totally overwhelming to someone with ADHD.
Which makes me think about treatment. I feel like most people, they hear ADHD and they think medication. But what I'm seeing in these sources, it's not that simple, is it? It's definitely more complicated than just here's a pill, you're cured. Like, I'm seeing medication in these sources, yeah, but also therapy, lifestyle changes. It seems like you need a whole bunch of different approaches.
And that's why this deep dive is so important, right? Because we're moving past those really simple ideas about ADHD. Like, yeah, medication can be super helpful, especially for managing those core symptoms, the inattention, the impulsivity, but it's not the whole story.
So it's like medication gives your brain the tools to like actually build that instruction manual we were talking about before. Now you've got a chance to, wrangle those Lego bricks into something cool.
That's such a great way to put it. But yeah, even with the right medication, therapy is still so key. And the research you found about cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, really important stuff.
CBT for ADHD? I thought that was more for like anxiety, depression.
A lot of people think that, yeah.
Yeah.
But CBT for ADHD is all about like rewiring those thought patterns and those behaviors that might be holding you back. It's like learning a new set of tools to use in your brain to deal with those executive function challenges.
So it's like a personalized user manual for your brain. That's pretty amazing. Okay, what about all this stuff about lifestyle changes? I'm seeing a lot about diet, exercise. Are we talking about miracle cures here?
Honestly, I think it's important to be realistic about these lifestyle things. Like the research on special ADHD diets, it's still kind of all over the place, but we know a healthy lifestyle is good for everyone, right?
Yeah, so maybe no magic cure hiding in the grocery store, but swapping the soda for water probably can't hurt, right?
Exactly. And don't forget about exercise. It might not cure ADHD, but the research you found, it suggests exercise can help with mood, with focus, even with those executive functions.
Like a shot of espresso for your brain, but without the caffeine crash afterward.
Exactly. Which leads to a bigger question, what does it even mean to like live well with ADHD? This deep dive has shown us it's not just about making the symptoms go away.
It's about more than that, right? We talked about the struggles, the science, the treatments, but what about like thriving? What does that look like for someone with ADHD?
This is where we need to change the conversation about ADHD. We need to move past just seeing the challenges and start recognizing the strengths.
Strengths, we haven't really talked about those much. What kind of strengths are we talking about here?
Think about it. People with ADHD, They're often bursting with creativity, and they can hyper-focus on things they love like you wouldn't believe. They bring a different way of seeing the world, a different perspective.
It's like their brains are wired for like innovation, always questioning, always thinking outside the box.
Exactly. And that's what we need to be talking about more. Because when we focus on those strengths, when we help create environments where those brains can really thrive, that's when amazing things happen.
That's such an important message. It's not about fixing ADHD. It's about seeing it as like a different way of being. Yeah, there are challenges. But there's also so much potential.
And that's what I'm hoping our listeners take away from this deep dive. Embrace your uniqueness, find the support you need, and never, ever underestimate the power of an ADHD brain.
This has been honestly really eye-opening. Thanks for taking us on this journey. And to everyone listening, remember, your brain is amazing. It's what makes you you. Embrace it, celebrate it, and never stop exploring the amazing things your mind can do. Until next time, keep those minds curious.